Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is J.R. DeShazo, and I'm the Dean of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you today to this important program on the future of federal housing policy. This convening could not have been more timely. Cities around the U.S., as you all know, are facing a new housing crisis. Housing is becoming less and less affordable. Housing costs are up, housing insecurity is up, and homelessness is up. They are all top concerns for Americans across the country today. We know that housing is important in its own right, but it also is the foundation for successful complementary policy. So if people are housed, healthcare, education, worker training, mental health, substance abuse programs, education, all work more effective if the individuals and families are housed. Here at the LBJ School, located at the capital city of Austin, we are experiencing many of the same challenges that are experienced across the country. And our students and faculty are looking for ways at the municipal and the state level to increase the affordability of housing. We have folks working on ensuring that folks are housed in recovery programs in ways that save taxpayers money, looking at how to match transportation solutions and access to housing so that people can get to the jobs and get to the healthcare and food services and things like that they need. And so today we're delighted to join with the LBJ Washington Center and the LBJ Urban Lab to convene this impressive panel of scholars and practitioners. All of the folks that you're going to hear from today have spent their lives identifying and trying to solve housing problems. Today, we're going to talk about President Biden's housing priorities and what challenges his administration is likely to face. We're going to debate what it would actually take to build the 7 million housing units that are necessary to satisfy our current affordable housing needs, and discuss many other topics. So in closing, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Preston Lee, who is one of today's distinguished panelists, but also the brainchild for today's convening. Preston is a 25-year veteran of the mortgage industry, and more important to me, at least as Dean of the LBJ School, he's a graduate of the LBJ School class of 1985. I'd also like to thank Stephen Pedigo, the director of the LBJ Urban Lab, without whom we would not be having today's convening. And now it's my great pleasure to get out of the way and to turn things over to Bill Shute, who is the director of the LBJ Washington Center. Thank you all and enjoy.
Well, thank you very much, JR, for joining us and kicking off what should be a very engaging conversation on federal housing policy. It is, as JR mentioned, co-hosted by the LBJ Urban Lab and Dr. Stephen Pedigo and the Washington Center of the LBJ School. The Washington Center is LBJ School's beachhead inside the Beltway, focusing on helping our faculty engage on pressing policy discussions of the day. And as a cornerstone of our center, we run a 2-year master's program with a DC concentration where our students spend their first year gaining the necessary skills to be in public affairs while in Austin, and immediately transitioning to Washington for an immersive 2 semesters before heading to an early graduation. It's also my pleasure to fill in a little more of the canvas about Preston Lee. As JR mentioned, he's the brainchild for this event, but I couldn't imagine a better person to do so. He is a veteran of more than 30 years in the mortgage finance and banking industries from a policy and implementation standpoint in Washington. He's a founding member, corporate treasurer of the Potomac Coalition, which is a nonpartisan policy and advocacy organization focusing on creating economic opportunity for urban Americans. He previously served as Senior Director of Industry Relations and Housing Outreach at Freddie Mac. And prior to joining Freddie Mac, served in the Clinton administration in numerous positions, notably Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at Housing and Urban Development. As JR mentioned, it's a point of personal pride and privilege to point out that not only is Preston Lee a graduate of the LBJ School, but serves as one of our most trusted advisors on the steering committee for the Washington Center. Preston, thank you so much for helping us put this together today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill, and good afternoon, everyone. Why federal housing policy now? And what is the future of federal housing policy in incentivizing the production of affordable housing? Our esteemed panel of experts will explore these, among other questions, with you today. But if I might, I wish to take just a few moments to set the stage with a couple of my thoughts on why federal housing policy is so vital to the production of affordable housing at this pivotal moment in our nation's history. First, need around rental assistance. There's little doubt that the recent pandemic has put a strain on many Americans' ability to afford places that they live, but this trend has been in play for years. It's no secret that housing costs are rising more quickly than incomes, and that housing markets have not responded very well with adequate supplies of housing. The result? 1/2 of Americans' households that rent spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And the poorest 20% of American families cannot afford rent in a standard apartment without some sort of subsidy. These rising rents leave more and more renters with less and less to live on. Today, 25% of renters spend more than half of their monthly income on rent, leaving barely enough to cover food, clothing, healthcare costs, much less save for emergencies, a home, or even build wealth. And nationally, there is a shortage of more than 7 million affordable homes in our nation, trying to house more than the 10.8 plus million extremely low-income families, 70% of whom are paying more than half of their income on rent. These challenges in housing affordability are driving conversations in communities large and small around the country, and therefore call for serious discussions and serious solutions at the federal level. Second, the federal government has a vital interest in ensuring positive health, education, and employment outcomes for children and adults. Federal housing policy can assist in achieving this objective. HUD's large-scale family option study notes that living in a stable, affordable household leads to substantial benefits in reducing food insecurity and school mobility. It also improves the well-being among adults as well as children. The study goes on to say, a stable home provides a platform for improved outcomes around employment, health, and education. HUD study concludes that the lack of stable housing can have long-lasting effects that can negatively impact the health, education, and employment opportunities throughout a person's lifetime. Third, the homeownership gap is widening. Today, the rise in house prices is putting economic opportunities that result from homeownership out of reach for more families, particularly those of color. Today, the homeownership rate for Hispanics is 48%. African Americans is at 42%, levels not seen in decades. The affordable housing shortfall is not just depressing savings, but is also a major factor in the increase in the wealth gap. Fourth, and finally, the federal government in many significant ways already occupies the affordable housing space, and it is therefore in prime position to increase the supply of affordable housing in the country. While cities, towns, and counties have a vital role to play in the funding process of affordable housing, most of the financial support for affordable programs comes from the federal government. In fact, aside from the low-income housing tax credit program, which is administered by the state and local housing finance agencies, and the Opportunity Zone tax expenditure overseen by the IRS, the rest of these programs is administered by HUD. I will stop there because I believe that this panel today will be robust and provide a lot of important information on these and other issues of policy facing us today. But folks, I am very excited right now. I really am, because it is my distinct honor to introduce today's moderator. The fact is that given the topic, I can think of no more qualified and distinguished a voice to guide today's discussion. The Honorable Dr. Henry G. Cisneros has spent a lifetime in public and private service devoted to bringing opportunity and capital to underserved communities. After earning bachelor's and master's degrees from Texas A&M University, a master's degree from Harvard, a PhD from George Washington University, both in public administration, he brought his considerable talent and energy back home to San Antonio, where he served 3 terms as a member of the San Antonio City Council. As a 4-term mayor of San Antonio, he worked to rebuild the city's economic base by recruiting convention business, attracting the high-tech industry, increasing tourism, and bringing jobs and affordable housing to San Antonio. In 1992, Dr. Cisneros was appointed 10th Secretary of HUD. As HUD Secretary, he initiated the reform and revitalization of public housing using the Hope 6 program to redevelop severely distressed public housing projects and increase funding for homeless assistance. In addition to directing HUD's focus on public housing and the homeless, he led HUD's drive to expand homeownership among the country's most underrepresented groups, young adults, minorities, and low and moderate income families. When Dr. Cisneros arrived at HUD, the homeownership rate was 63.7%. When he left office, it had risen to 65.7%, its highest level since 1981. Under policies set in place by Secretary Cisneros, by the end of President Clinton's 2nd term, homeownership continued its upward trend to 67.5%. Since leaving public office, Dr. Cisneros has remained actively involved in housing development and urban revitalization. After serving as President and Chief Operating Officer of Univision Communications, the nation's largest Spanish language broadcaster, Dr. Cisneros established a firm to develop affordable housing in San Antonio and other American cities. That company would become CityView, which would go on to partner in the development of residential areas in more than 100 communities, 13 states, and building more than 7,000 homes with a total value of more than $5 billion. From the time he attended a conference on American city issues while in college, through his terms as mayor, HUD secretary, to present day, Dr. Cisneros has been on a crusade to build America's future by improving its city's core, along with creating affordable housing for the core of America's workers, like police, nurses, teachers, city workers, and other underserved communities. the winner of numerous National Public Service Awards and honors, holder of more than 20 honorary doctorates from leading universities, author and editor of several books, business person, lecturer, and sought-after public speaker. Today, Dr. Cisneros is chairman and co-chief investment officer of American III, an investment infrastructure firm based in New York. He is also the vice chairman and of the board of directors and equity owner of Shank Williams Cisneros and Company, LLC, a principal at Seibert Williams Shank and Company, LLC, a national municipal and corporate finance firm, and of course, the founder of CityView. On a personal note, it was my honor to meet Secretary Cisneros when he was mayor and I was a student at the LBJ school during one of our featured brown bag series. And he was a great speaker. And I remember that day like it was yesterday. And the fact is that 10 years later, I was privileged and honored to serve under Henry Cisneros when I served at HUD. So the secretary has been an inspiration to me and to countless others. So it is now my great privilege and pleasure to present the moderator for today's panel, the Honorable Dr. Henry G. Cisneros.
Preston, thank you so very much for your very, very kind comments. I will always appreciate and respect the work that you did in our years at HUD. I've had the pleasure of knowing Preston for more than 25 years. I remember when he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at HUD and was in the room for all of the major decisions that we made on matters related to public housing and affordable housing, the home ownership rate, homelessness, the whole panoply of concerns in that time. Preston was there and has made contributions to our country in the years since. Preston, thank you. I don't have words to adequately thank you for your kind words this morning. I also want to thank the LBJ School. And this Preston is an example of the products of the LBJ School. Thank the LBJ Washington Center and the LBJ Urban Lab. I know that President Johnson, I was the beneficiary of his important work in this field, not only working at HUD, but programs like the White House Fellows Program. And I know that what he brought to the presidency and his public service, he would have been very proud to see this continuing work in the school that bears his name. We have a panel this morning that is a very impressive panel for their expertise and backgrounds. They're also a panel from diverse platforms. As you hear them, as they're introduced, as we discuss with each of them, you will see representation from HUD, from MIT, from the Urban Institute, from the private sector banking sector, TD Bank, and from affordable advocacy in the Central Texas area. Very important array of backgrounds. They represent a commitment to action, and we look forward to hearing their thoughts. Very importantly, Preston laid out the framework of concerns as well as policy directions. It's broad in the housing sector today and very important. I would say housing has reached the point of crisis in many communities, either because it is unaffordable or because there's insufficient decent housing, because people are overcrowded, because we have a crisis in rentals in almost every major metropolitan area in the country, in terms of families being able to afford rentals. And of course, we have some 700,000 people homeless on the streets of America's cities every night. So despite the fact that housing doesn't get the marquee treatment in policy discussions and national debate, it is important. The format will be for me to ask about 5 minutes worth of questions from each of our panelists individually, as was described earlier, and then we'll try to get a discussion, including some questions before we finish. We'll start with Peggy Bailey, who's a senior advisor on rental assistance in the Office of the Secretary of HUD, Secretary Fudge. And Peggy's responsibilities include policies related principally to the Department's rental subsidy and supply programs. That includes the Housing Choice Voucher program and oversight of public housing programs. Prior to joining HUD, she was at the highly respected Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, which we relied upon heavily in my day at HUD. Peggy, thank you so much for joining us. You bring the voice of the department today to this discussion. And I'd like to begin by asking you if you could give us a short précis on the priorities that Secretary Fudge has in housing matters generally, but particularly the affordability agenda.
Yes, so thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you to the LBJ School for inviting me and HUD here today. And I want to double down on how Preston laid out our charge here today for the discussion. And what I think is important about where we're at is to understand that this is about economics, right? The challenges around housing are a very complex, supply and demand conversation, right? We don't have enough supply of housing, and the demand is increasing, especially now during the pandemic with the supply chain issues that we have. But then underneath that, there's the supply issue of affordable housing broadly, and the demand for more affordable housing, because, as Preston noted, incomes are not increasing nearly at the rate of rent in particular, or home or single family housing in this country. And so and what's important to understand about that, right, is that as we do need to create more supply of affordable housing, there's a subsidy component as well, because incomes just aren't keeping up. We live in a capitalist country. You don't have control over how much your income is going to increase, no matter how many classes we all take or job training we send people to. There's just a point at which incomes aren't keeping up with rent costs. So there's a subsidy component of that as well. So, as far as the administration is concerned, we're trying to address the supply issues. There was an announcement from the White House and HUD earlier in September around supply. One of the actions that HUD has taken is to restart the Federal Housing Agency's risk share program, so that we can help in the mortgage space and create what we estimate to be about 100,000 new units of housing. But access to the subsidy piece is important as well. As President Biden has committed to helping us work toward universal assistance when it comes to the rental subsidy programs, we all know that only about a quarter of households who are eligible for federal rental assistance receive it. That leaves 75% of households who need rental assistance, who fit into those statistics that Preston laid out, that don't get that assistance. And that's what leads to poor outcomes like homelessness, but also housing instability just generally is a challenge. Secretary Fudge has a priority around first-time home buyers and trying to help people have assistance in that space. And the last piece is credit history, particularly for renters. It's a part that doesn't get talked about enough, that so many low-income renters don't have the credit history to be able to move into the homeownership space, and we're committed to that as well.
Peggy, we're in a place where there are the normal housing programs, and then there is the money that's available because of COVID, which the CARES Act and subsequent the Rescue Act, and now the discussion about housing as infrastructure to make it into either the hard infrastructure, but more likely the reconciliation package, where a huge number, 300 billion, was originally included for housing. That number is likely to shrink as the reconciliation total package will shrink from 3.5 trillion originally to whatever the number is, 2 or whatever it's going to be. How do you see the survival of housing programs in the eventual reconciliation package?
Well, as you said, we're committed to housing being a housing as infrastructure. The secretary probably tweets that at least once a week, if not more.
Right.
And so housing is critical. Our priorities are around public housing, also multifamily retrofitting and helping regenerate multifamily housing. And there are pieces of the bills that are moving through Congress that handle the demand side. The House has a voucher component. There's down payment assistance. Broadly, we just want to make sure that however the Congress works through their negotiations in this space. And I am a first-time federal employee, so I'm working very hard to make sure that I stay within the lines of what we're working on here is to make sure that we're committed to increasing the supply and understanding that housing is the foundation for all the things that families want to do, and that if you can't afford a place to live, then you're behind the curve in so many other areas like health and education for your kids.
Sure. You've said it well, and you have touched on the key points from the perspective of the department that's primarily responsible for housing. Thank you for that. A quick word, just if you would, on the eviction situation. Where do we stand? What's the big picture on evictions?
So big picture evictions, federally, it's hard to know what's happening in the eviction space. There's so many different ways that evictions happen besides formal court evictions. We know that families often will move before they're formally evicted, but we have a whole of government approach to helping the Treasury Department and local grantees implement the emergency rental assistance program. Over the last several months, you can see a ramping up of that assistance getting out to the people who need it. We're continuing to push in that space. Treasury also is looking at how to reallocate funds from places that haven't been that aren't spending their emergency rental assistance, maybe don't need as much money as they got, to shift it toward places that do need their emergency rental assistance dollars and are spending it quickly. So we're committed to making sure that people stay in their homes during this time.
Peggy, thank you. Stand by, please. We'll come back to you, but we want to move through the other panelists. The next person would be Edward Golding, who is Executive Director and Senior Lecturer at the MIT Golub Center for Finance and Public Policy. He has been head of the principal housing authority in our country, which is FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, where he was from 2015 to 2017. He worked on the expansion of the Housing Trust Fund, an important new housing tool in Washington, and for some decades was at Freddie Mac. Mr. Golding, what are the three greatest challenges in developing the more than 7 million units that people have said are necessary to satisfy the need for affordable housing? We know right now on the rental side that there isn't one single metropolitan area in America where a family earning the minimum wage can afford the rent on a 2-bedroom apartment at the fair market price. It's not affordable. And we know also that the home ownership rate has dropped from higher levels as multiple crises, the financial crisis, and then now the COVID crisis have, worked their way through the housing markets. So we're short on supply, and we know there are barriers to that. And you have been a person who's worked on this agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. It's an honor to be here. I should have worn my all the way with LBJ button that I got when I was 9. I can't find it though. Let me go quickly and leave plenty of time for discussion. But if you were looking at sort of the three factors, the first one has to be on the supply side, the cost of building, and that's everything from cost of labor, the cost of land, including permitting, and the cost of raw materials. If you look at those three elements, that really implicates a whole host of policies, government policies ranging from local zoning to trade policy, to immigration policy, to education and training. So the cost of building affordable units are, expensive, and we do need to focus on how to lower costs. But let me just leave that for a moment, because that is a huge topic of itself. And also the other one that people have talked a little bit about is the second category I would put in things in are sort of equitable access to credit. Work I did with some co-authors showed that Black homeowners over their lifetime spend $60,000 more on homeownership because of credit overlays and risk-based pricing and the like. And we really have to make the housing finance system more equitable so that the benefits are enjoyed by underserved communities of color and others on that. So we really have to focus on that. Then the third area, which is very high there, that everyone's comments have highlighted, is just government expenditures. And I don't like to use the word subsidy, but government expenditures have not kept up. Whether it's first-time home buyer credits that we used to have, and we used to subsidize my father through the VA program when he returned from the war. Section 8 vouchers are only funded at about a fourth of where they should be. Housing for seniors and disabled. We haven't really invested any new money in that housing. Public housing, $50 billion capital shortfall in improvements. Low-income housing tax credits haven't kept up. I could go down the list. We clearly have not kept, we've disinvested at a period when we should have been investing more. So I think of those as the three main areas that we need to focus on.
Thank you.
Cost of building, access, and government expenditures.
You've stated in concrete ways some of the shortfalls that have created both the supply problems as well as the demand imbalance. If you were to be asked, advising the administration, let us say, on the one or two things that they should do, people have different things that they favor. Some say we need to increase vouchers. Some say we need to increase low-income housing tax credits. What would you say would be the priorities now?
Okay, well, let me, I'm going to be a little reluctant to pick, but I will end up picking it. But I think, one thing to remember is that the effectiveness of any program depends on three things. It's really the, expenditures that we put into it, the money, we just talked about that. It's the people, and it's the technology and the systems. Since when you were Secretary of HUD, I think we've reduced the number of people at almost half. In comparison, the GSEs, the Freddies and the Fannies have tripled their employment in the same size. So one of the things, I keep on coming back to the pipes. We really need to invest in the delivery systems. I think we see that even today when we talked about rental assistance. We don't even have the pipes always to get the money there. So wherever we choose our priorities, I think it's very important that we do sustainable mechanisms so that it's not just a one-off solution, that we invest in it. And I think the other lesson we have to learn is not to overly complicate the programs. HAMP, the foreclosure program in 2008, was just too complicated. This time we learned and got foreclosure relief much more quickly. So I think we have to pick a few, make sure we fund the programs, including the infrastructure, and keep them a little simpler than we've had in the past. So
you were going to pick.
If I was going to pick anything, my heart is always with, I would do two things: Section 8 vouchers, a massive increase in that, and I would also promote homeownership, first-time homeownership subsidies.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. If you'll stand by, we'll be back. Next, we go to Yannicka Ratcliffe, who's Associate Vice President for Housing Finance Policy at the Urban Institute, where I'm fortunate to be a board member. And we have one of the best housing finance research groups anywhere in the country. And Yannicka's part of that. She was previously at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Yannicka, if you were looking at the reality of the affordable crisis, what are the incentives that you would building upon what Edward Golding has just said, Professor Golding, what would be your choices in terms of policy initiatives related to affordability?
Thank you so much, Secretary Cisneros. It's so good to be with you today and the LBJ team. I do want to emphasize, as you know, the Urban Institute doesn't take opinions on policy positions and pending legislation. So I do want to make clear that anything I say today does not reflect the opinion of the Urban Institute. I too find it hard to pick, and one of the things that I see is the need for a lot of balance across the home ownership and the rental, the housing supply and the housing demand side, the federal government and the local response, and how all those pieces fit together. And so, I could talk a lot. I know that we have a lot of desperate needs on the rental side, everything across the spectrum, all the way from affordable subsidized rental and down to the homelessness question. We tend to specialize in home ownership, so I can address a few points there. First, as Ed said, focusing on building on the affordable starter home side, where there is a particular lack of demand, particular growth in home prices, because there's so much demand and competition from investors as well as would-be first-time home buyers. And this will require, what did Ed say, expenditures to address the high costs he talked about, as well as perhaps some subsidies for construction financing. We also need to look at our existing housing stock closely. It's getting quite old. More than half of the homes in the existing stock today were built before 1979. And it's one reason, the aging stock is one reason that new home buyers cannot compete with investors, because their investors are able to finance and put in up to 15, 30, some as much as 40,000 on average for every house they buy to rent. And sellers and we also hear about sellers flat out refusing to consider offers from FHA buyers because they are afraid that the property won't pass the muster of the inspection. So anything that makes it easier for owner occupants or community-oriented developers, this could unlock hundreds of thousands of units in our existing supply and stabilize neighborhoods in the process. So those are just a couple of the areas.
Yannicka, using your perspective and spanning years, how would you characterize the present housing environment or crisis, if you will, as compared to other times? It does appear, at least in my view, that we're at a sharper point than we have been in the past. And perhaps there's more recognition of the primacy of housing as a platform that's necessary to accomplish most of the other social objectives we have in education or healthcare or family stability. How do you see it now compared to other times?
Oh, well, I think we might have to look way, way back. I'm thinking about something, analogous to maybe right after World War II, right? We had sort of had this depression, which, something analogous to the recession, Great Recession.
Right.
And then we had, after the end of the war, a huge housing shortage, just like we have today, and a concerted recognition to really place housing and home ownership sort of front and center. And so there was this massive effort. Some 21 million units were built in the decade of the 50s. These were, really targeted largely to first-time home buyers. They were made affordable through, the relatively new FHA at the time made this 30-year fixed-rate, low-down payment mortgage accessible to the masses. And so that's kind of the best analog. The one thing that's important to remember is that these policies also contained, whether federal or local, a great number of race-based barriers. So we ended up seeing a big increase in the home ownership rate, but this primarily went to white households. Mm-hmm. And it's actually some of the things that we did back then that explicitly baked in the inequities that we still are living with today. So I think, there's a lot of to be taken away from that. Where there is a will, I think we can find a way. But what we have to do today is really place equity front and center in the policy making and decision making in order to rebalance this.
I'm very glad you said that because one of the most important priorities before us is reducing the persistence of racial segregation and concentrations of poverty. And some of our previous housing programs didn't do that. They did exactly the opposite, concentrating poverty in public housing density, moving white communities, allowing them to move to the suburbs, which were segregated. So whatever we do in the housing field needs to have equity and inclusion as dimensions. I think you're totally right about that. Thank you. And if you'll stand by also, we'll come back to you. But we want to go next to Michael Innes Thompson, who's a senior vice president and head of community lending and development at TD Bank, where he drives the bank's Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, operational strategy. He has a background in banking, including at other banks, and has always worked in this multicultural lending strategy area. So I'd like to begin by asking Michael, can you give us some sense of the connection between community lending and affordable housing, and how well, obviously you're most familiar with TD Bank, so tell us a little bit about what the bank is doing, but also how you see the larger connection between private sector banking and the push for housing affordability.
First, thank you, Mr. Secretary, for having me here and for the LBJ School. So from the private sector and financial services sector, mainly banking, the CRA really has what's called the lending test. And it looks at mortgages, small business, but there are also community development loans, which are designed to really help construct permanent affordable housing and also put investments via low income housing tax credit. So it's very important from financial institutions standpoint in supporting this. And despite the efforts that we make here, we're still discussing a 7 million shortfall in housing. So a lot more to be done there. And in terms of the CRA, I think it would also benefit some revision where banks would get more credit for loans that they make outside of their assessment areas in terms of community development loans or LIHTC investments.
The banking community, how does it view these initiatives that are presently being considered in the administration, the infrastructure measures, the reconciliation measures? Does the private sector, do banks see these as tools to be worked with by the private sector in order to make 2 + 2 = 5 in terms of impact?
A great question, and I'll provide my personal opinion. I do think the administration's plan are very important because housing is at the core of our economy, and it represents roughly 15 to 18%, along with other supporting industries of our GDP, and that's according to the National Association of Home Builders. So it's very important that we support the administration's plans, and especially in the context of the conversations we've been having here today, having more ability to do LIHTC lending, making sure that homes that come available through REO, through either HUD or Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, are given an opportunity not to investors, but rather to first-time home buyers who are in much need of these homes that are now being acquired by investors for cash. So it's important that we support the administration's plan, and it's very aggressive. However, I do think it's a plan for a path forward and will help to really address some of the challenges that the panel has discussed here today.
Michael, give us a sense of how it works in practical, in the specific instance of TD Bank. How many cities are you in? How many cities do you have capacity to do mortgage lending and assist people, counseling? And so just give us a sense of how TD Bank is committed to this.
So TD Bank is an East Coast bank. We're from Maine to Florida, except we're not in Georgia. And so that's our banking footprint. So a footprint that has many cities that could benefit from acquisition and rehabilitation. For example, looking at large cities like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New York, where We have a large footprint in New York and in South Jersey and Philadelphia region. So that's our footprint. And we work to really drive in terms of getting, and we've exceeded our investments in terms of community development loans that support affordable rental housing on the debt side, and on the equity side, we're investing in low-income housing tax credits. But there's always an opportunity to do more.
And the bank treats this as a priority among its multiple priorities. Where does this fit?
It is definitely a priority. When we look at how we've performed on the CRA side over the last couple of exam cycles, we've really exceeded the goal that has been given, that's set under the Community Reinvestment Act, or CRA, for our investments both in LIHTC and in community development loans.
Michael, thank you for being with us. And if you'll hang on, we'll come back to you. There may be some questions. Thank you for your work at the bank and leadership in the banking sector generally in this arena. Our final panelist is David Steinweil, who is the CEO of a group called Affordable Central Texas. And for those of you who are watching the growth patterns across the country, you'll know that Central Texas, particularly Austin, is one of the fastest growing regions in the country, drawing Fortune 500 companies from all over the country to headquarter in Austin, and bringing, obviously, workforce. So the pressure on the housing stock is immense, the need for additional housing stock. And that, of course, creates pressures of affordability as well. David has an unusual background for housing advocacy, which is that he spent 34 years in the real estate industry and in real estate investment. And he now brings best practices from private equity and asset management to try to deal with the affordability questions, which are, if left unattended, an impediment to the full potential of Austin's development, because housing prices will rise and they'll become a discouragement to people, particularly people, young professionals, coming to the opportunities that are there. David, why don't you begin by just telling us the approach that you bring? Affordable Central Texas is the name of the organization. What does it do? What are your goals? How are you going about them?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you to the LBJ School. As you mentioned, I am unusual because I've only been in affordable housing for about 3 or 4 years. What Affordable Central Texas is a nonprofit that's the sponsor and investment manager for the Austin Housing Conservancy Fund. And the fund is a private equity fund, an open-end private equity fund that's been targeted to preserve workforce affordable housing in Central Texas. Our concept is really pretty simple. We buy and preserve existing multifamily communities. Right now we have 4 properties totaling 1,000 units, about 130 million in value. And we do a simple thing. We just keep our rental rates tied to the growth in wage growth. And in a place like Austin, which has experienced dramatic growth over the last 10 years, wage growth has been a small factor relative to the overall rental rate growth that's happened, especially in the last 10 or 12 years. Austin is an unusual place. We've gotten what we wished for, which was tremendous growth. Sometimes you need to be careful about what you wish for, because Austin in the last 10 to 12 years has gone from being the least expensive big city for both rental and homeownership in Texas to now the most expensive big city in both rental costs and in homeownership costs. And what's happened is we've now have an affordability challenge that's moved beyond the traditional low and very low income to those that are in moderate income levels of workforce. That includes teachers, bank tellers, a whole variety of folks, even entry-level tech workers in Austin, who people point to as being the reason for our success. They're becoming challenged in terms of their ability to afford rental housing.
David, Austin has a highly visible notable, almost tragic homeless problem. It's been in the national news because of the disputes between the local government and the state government, the governor, on homeless policy. Are these related, the housing shortfall question and the homeless issue in your mind?
They are. One of the things that we looked at during the pandemic was what happens to your middle income residents when they become challenged by the loss of a job or some economic downturn. And what we've discovered is that people that are earning 60, 70, 80% of median income generally have very low savings, less than a month's worth of rent in savings. And despite maybe the traditional thought is that if you move from middle income, you go to low income and then very low income. What actually can happen to folks is they can, if they lose the ability to maintain their place of residence, they can become homeless. Mm-hmm. It's a one step down, not a gradual decline. Yeah. And Austin's issues around homelessness are exacerbated by some of the tremendous success that we've had. Places where people could traditionally be taken care of have now been lost to redevelopment, and so we have to expand our capacity to take care of those that are suffering homelessness, not only in housing but in providing a level of support that frankly is more expensive than the actual housing itself. In terms of mental health care and other health care needs that these folks have.
Do you expect on the ground level, as you are, that the problem will be exacerbated by evictions as eviction moratoria end?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing's happening in Austin. Even before the eviction moratoriums are now coming to an end, our occupancy levels have moved to a very, very high level, and we have spikes in rental rates occurring already. The last quarter in Austin, there was a 6% increase in rental rates. That'd be a 24% annualized increase if that continues for the next 12 months. So unfortunately, the question is going to be what's going to happen when people get hit not only by the potential for eviction, but also by the impact that they may have in terms of much higher rental rates that they're going to have to absorb.
So from your perspective, you follow the national news and the initiatives that the administration has. What of the range of things that are being discussed would be most helpful for the set of problems that you've identified?
So looking at it from a moderate income workforce perspective, there aren't any subsidies truly that are provided at this level. We are able to take advantage of some relief from real estate taxes that we can get on a local level. But on a national level, really, I think it needs to happen in terms of a broadening of the tax credit program. Expanded to include much higher income levels in locations like Austin. In addition, while we have 3 banks that have invested equity into our fund, I think a greater acceptance of equity investment and for CRA compliance could be incredibly helpful. And then actually, I think there should be some things that are done for the individual residents in terms of the ones that are struggling to build savings. Something simple like elimination of taxes on saving balances below $20,000, so that if people have the chance to start saving, that they don't have that eaten up through taxes.
Right.
And then they can get into the ability to have that as a down payment to buy a house.
Well, your view is exceedingly important because you're on the ground and have to inform, national policy on things that are likely to work. So sometimes there's a disconnect between the way we see things at the national level because we're building on previous experience and don't take and can't take into account what's actually happening on the ground in new circumstances that we've not confronted before. Let's go to the questions if we can. I think the LBJ School team is going to help us with the questions that have been presented by our participants today. Steve, do you have questions?
Yes, I do. Mr. Secretary, thanks for joining us. If we can have all the other participants come online, that'd be great. I'll go through them. So one of the questions, one of the very first questions that we had when this panel kicked off comes from Karen, and Karen is wanting to know, what can we and the federal government do to encourage cooperative housing for both renters and folks who wish to build cooperative dwellings with limited equity? Thoughts on that question?
Ed, do you have some thoughts on cooperative housing strategies?
Well, again, a lot of times we just have to get more, I'll use the word subsidy. We have to just get more subsidies into these programs, and we have to do it in a way that is not overly complicated. So it's in some sense I'll go back to building the pipes so that we can do it in a repeatable fashion at very low cost and in a much more predictable way.
Cooperative housing has great promise, I think, and it may not be represented well in many of the existing programs. So it would be important to try to adjust programs for this promising approach of cooperative housing. That would be, I think, my response. Janneke, you look like you may have something to say on this.
I'm thinking about cooperative housing as one of a number of sort of options along the spectrum that deserve some attention and thinking, whether it's by financing or subsidy or other ways to encourage them. And again, that might involve local cooperation and land use planning adjustments. That can include everything from cooperatives, 2 to 4 units, accessory dwelling units, manufactured housing. And I think the list could go on a bit, but these are examples of some areas that could contribute to supply with some combination of this match between federal and local changes.
I think the important thing, Karen, to take away from this discussion of cooperative housing is that it is an important and useful tool, and we need every tool that we can apply. Cooperative housing is one of those. And as Ed said, need more funding generally that applies, and we should try to adjust our existing programs so that as Janneke said, new models, alternative means of producing supply can be successful. Steve, other questions?
So yeah, great. Thank you all for that. A question from Katie. Katie asked, if the Biden administration expands the provision of Section 8 housing vouchers to meet demand, how does it impact the lack of available landlords and properties to accept those vouchers? So talking about maybe the supply and demand of what that would look like around Section 8 vouchers.
That's a good question, because we have had bottlenecks, if you will, in the use of Section 8 vouchers by landlords who won't accept them or want to accept them on their terms. One of the things that we initiated back in my watch, but has been expanded over the years, is indicating to landlords, if they are going to accept vouchers, then they have to really recognize this is a public sector support for them, and they need to be cooperative in allowing more people to use them. Now, there also need to be some restrictions on abuse of Section 8. So you want to make sure that people don't move in and then destroy buildings that landlords have with the excessive numbers of Section 8 in them. That's been a problem in some places. We have to acknowledge transparently that's a truth. But clearly, we can't have landlords cherry picking or discriminating in the use of Section 8. They have to accept people who come with Section 8. They're getting a massive assistance in their meeting their mortgage obligations and financial obligations with Section 8. And there's a public interest side to this that has to be respected. Other comments on Section 8?
Yeah, so
sorry, go ahead, please, Peggy.
Yeah, building on that point, there is evidence that we can show from COVID, from the pandemic, that landlords that accepted federal rental assistance did better because their rent was paid,
Of
because
course.
the programs are designed to adjust with people's incomes. So that is one area where we're looking at. There's also building on evidence that Urban Institute has worked on around source of income anti-discrimination efforts in communities like Oregon and in Texas that have not only implemented source of income discrimination policies and required landlords to accept Section 8 vouchers and not discriminate against them, but provided resources to support landlords to enforce that policy, first of all, which is critical. Sometimes the policy is just created without any enforcement, and that really doesn't do much. But also providing resources that help landlords, attract landlords to the program. And we've learned a lot about that. And with the emergency housing voucher program, we've implemented some of that, allowing PHAs to have the resources to create landlord incentive pools that help pay for damage or pay for repairs when we're doing inspections. All of those things can help bring landlords into the.
Very good points. Section 8 is much more than just a housing program. It does allow people to get into housing at 30% of their income, and therefore get into housing that they might not otherwise be able to get into. But it's also a way to get closer to the workplace, to break up concentrations of poverty by integrating people into the larger economy. And we've seen lives changed by the use of Section 8 in a metropolitan-wide fashion, getting people out to the jobs at the airport, at the industrial park, at the medical center, et cetera, in cities all across the country. So when it is properly supported, and we had experiments, and the Urban Institute was part of them, with what was called moving to opportunity and other ways to bulk up Section 8 so it came with housing assistance, but a lot of other supports for families, lives were changed in profound ways. David?
If I could just from a moderate income, because there's a carrot and a stick approach, and I think the carrot that could be applied could be done through like agency debt. So Fannie and Freddie providing an additional incentive in terms of a rate discount to provide or take Section 8 vouchers could be highly beneficial. Another thing that hasn't been used very much is equity investments from the Fannie and Freddie into a variety of things, which could then carry requirements to provide Section 8 housing and Section 8 voucher acceptance could also be beneficial.
Interesting. Other thoughts, comments? Edward, did you want to say something?
Quickly, I'm just reminding you know this very well, Mr. Secretary, but there's also property-based Section 8 vouchers for tenants, and there's a role for that. It has to be carefully administered. But why not build new affordable apartments and use property-based,
project-based,
yeah.
Yep, right. But Steve, I think we have time for another couple of questions.
We do. There's a question actually about emergency rental assistance, and this is from Katie. Katie says, given the substantial difficulties that many renters have had in applying for this type of assistance and the discrimination that many have faced in getting their landlords to accept it, has the federal government considered suspending rental payments and requiring landlords to apply directly for emergency relief instead of keeping the burden on the renter?
Peggy, you're right in the middle of this.
Yeah,
it's a great question.
Yeah, so we're trying to figure out the right balance, right? How do we make payments directly to landlords, but protect tenants and make sure that that we don't have the challenge of landlords accepting assistance but still evicting on the other end, because we can't have oversight in that. So that's part of what we're trying to balance. But that said, landlords can apply for the emergency rental assistance programs and should be able to everywhere. It's according to Treasury. And if they're not, we should be working with those grantees to change the program so that they can. And all that's required is that they connect with the tenants, or they have some proof, right, that the tenants haven't paid their rent and have lost income due to COVID. So if you're having challenges with that, you should definitely reach out your local grantees, but also to you can send an email to me, and we can work with the Treasury Department to make sure that that the programs are operating in the way that the Treasury intends them to.
Other comments from other panelists on this question before we go to another question? Okay, Steve?
Sure, we've got time for one more question. And this question's from an anonymous attendee. But would love to hear the panelists' thought on the role for tenant eligibility screening for previous maybe criminal offenses. The attendee is concerned about local PHAs imposing additional barriers that maybe exceed HUD's bans. So just wanted to get thoughts on that perspective.
It's a very difficult subject, and let me just describe my experience with this from years past. I, as secretary, visited many public housing developments and other subsidized community developments where it was the tenants who were asking for help in reducing criminal activity, some of which was result of gangs being directed literally from prison. So we were responsible for putting in some restrictions in that era, some of the HUD restrictions, because there were buildings full of single-headed households, single head of household mothers who basically said, this is out of control. We have criminal activity that we have to get a handle on. Now, I'm not suggesting that should prevent people with criminal records to coming in. Obviously not. People have to have a place to live. Many people have been rehabilitated and they've recognized whatever criminal activity they had has been addressed. And we must be compassionate in that regard. But there is the countervailing side, which is we're trying to create places where families can live and mothers can raise their children, and have to be cognizant of some balance in our thinking about this subject. Peggy?
Yeah, and so one of the things that there are a couple of things that we're looking at. One is picking up from the Obama administration, the 2016 letter that the Office of Fair Housing explained the parameters with which the secretary talked about, ways that people can screen, and the things that are a fair housing violation, especially given the overrepresentation of people of color in the criminal justice system. We intend to pick that letter back up and look at ways to strengthen that, to explain what the rules are and how, in some cases, PHAs have too broad a brush of who they screen out of housing. Another piece is prior to HUD and prior to being at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, I was at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. And so we're lifting up those efforts, going back to David and the carrot approach, right? There are cost savings to be had if we house particularly people who frequently enter into jails and prisons, and therefore there are incentives for states and localities to invest dollars into housing, because we've shown that, especially given the overrepresentation of people with mental health issues and substance use issues, if we provide housing with the appropriate support services connected to that housing, we can really reduce recidivism, reduce state and local costs in jails and prisons. And Denver, the Urban Institute is an evaluator of a project in Denver that's done this, that's looked at how to compare housing and social support services together, reduce money, and reinvest that back into the system. And it's been something that I got to work on when I was at CSH and building that program, and it's been great to see the results for people in Denver in particular.
Thank you for your work on these subjects at various points in your career, Peggy. And let me just say, if you would do us the honor of passing on to Secretary Fudge our admiration for the work that she's doing and the background that she brings as a former mayor of Warrensville, Ohio, before she was a congressperson from that district, to the job at HUD. These are very naughty KNOTTY problems. And there's no easy answer to them, and finding the balance that creates the best life for people is what we strive to do at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Steve, I know that we've come to the end of our time, but let me just say thank you again to the LBJ School for leading the way and putting this together. It should be clear from what you've heard in the panelists, from the panelists and from their answers, that we're facing dire housing problems in our country. Housing is generally not mentioned among people's prime concerns of issues, but I think we're at a time when it actually is. It is a very serious set of issues that will impede our achievement of other goals and create great suffering in the lives of many people if we can't get these things right. We also have opportunities because of the funding that is being discussed in the reconciliation bill and in other measures. I think the administration has been very generous in the COVID responses to include housing, and we need to stay on course and take some of the discussion here today and move it forward. We support the work that the Congress will do in the next weeks and months to provide additional funding, and hopefully a good measure of that understands the significance of housing and the funding that's needed in housing.
Great. Thank you all for attending.